on high, what brings you here to mystify?
Hi, good afternoon, and thanks for tuning into the Kate Valentine UFO Show on 1160 WVNJ. Returning today as our guest is Mr. Nick Redfern. Now, if you have had even a passing interest in UFOs, you are familiar with Mr. Redfern and his investigations, writings, and appearances on numerous TV and radio shows. Now, today he's going to be here with us to talk about his latest book entitled Keep Out. So welcome to the show, Nick. Thanks so much for being here.
Hey, Kate. Thanks for having me on again.
Oh, it's great. Listen, I was wondering if it's okay with you. I'd just like to read the first paragraph of your book, the introduction.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, it goes, Area 51, Hangar 18, Montauk, Pine Gap, Fort Detrick, Rudlow Manor, Zitker, Porton Down, the Dugway Proving Ground, and Dulce Base. These are just a handful of the many highly classified installations of which the governments of the United States, Australia, China, Russia, the United Kingdom, and elsewhere prefer that we, the general public, remain steadfastly ignorant. Those governments have extremely good reasons for wishing us to remain in the dark. It is at these secret facilities that for decades clandestine research is said to have been undertaken into, among other things, lethal viruses, genetic manipulation, crashed UFOs, deceased alien entities, biological warfare, mind control experimentation, futuristic aircraft and spacecraft, teleportation, weather modification, invisibility, time travel, and much, much more of a conspiratorial and cosmic nature. That is one hell of a paragraph, Nick. That was great. That was phenomenal. And it sort of summed up your whole book, which was, I told you, it's been my favorite book of yours.
Oh, well, thanks. I mean, it's one of those things where, it's when you're writing a book, you want to be able to get across to people from the very beginning as to what it is you're actually writing about. So, I always feel that if you can kind of give them, sort of drop them in at the deep end, if you like, at the very beginning, and then expand on what it is actually that you've summarized to start with. So. Now,
one of the points you make is that these bases, although what goes on in them is secret, they themselves are somewhat hidden. So how did you find out how does this information come to you?
Well, I mean, a lot of the time, I just use the Freedom of Information Act. I don't do anything illegally. I'm not one of these people who sort of tries to jump the fence at military bases and things. To me, that's just stupid. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I know.
To take that approach or to hack computers and all that sort of thing, to me, that's just reckless. And people deserve what they get, basically, at the end of the day. And they're going to get, in today's world, hanging around a military base or a classified installation is not a good thing to do. So I basically sort of take an investigative journalistic approach to it, which is what I do in my sort of regular writing as well. And again, to use the Freedom of Information Act to interview sort of retired military and government people, hopefully on the record, and get them to talk about their recollections, etc., and try and put the story together that way, because I think when you're dealing with controversial issues, you have to do it in a credible fashion, because otherwise you just come across looking like, just like a crazy person who sees a conspiracy around every corner, and the sort of image that the media has of us, but in reality most people are sort of very in the field and level-headed, and we do our research as we would applying to any story. So, things like Area 51, Area 51, it's kind of like an oxymoron, because it's the world's most famous secret base. It's like, well, how can you have a famous secret base? It's either famous or it's secret. How can it be both? But actually, that is the case. Area 51 out in the Nevada desert, everybody knows about it. Everybody's heard the rumors about crashed UFOs being stored there, but nobody can actually get there. That's what makes it sort of a fascinating place, if you like.
It was great. But you say that came to attention, or to the public attention, through Bob Lazar, who himself is an extraordinarily controversial figure. Yeah. I mean, even Stanton Friedman, who's also, he backs up his research with solid investigation, and he felt that Lazar was totally a bunk, in his words.
Stan put it, bunk. But, yeah, I mean, Area 51, the whole story is an interesting one.
Yeah.
A lot of people think there is no such place, but there actually is. It actually is part of what's called the Nevada Security Test Site. It used to be called the Nevada test and training range, and it's this vast area that literally extends for thousands of square miles of Nevada desert. And basically, its origins go back to the 1950s. And for example, the U-2 spy plane and later the SR-71 Blackbird spy plane, they were both developed out at Area 51, and because it has this huge runway out there, so it was the ideal place to test fly classified planes, because other than Las Vegas, which is about actually it's only like a 90-mile drive from downtown Vegas to Area 51, but because of all the surrounding mountains, etc., and the isolated location and the security, nobody can get within like about 15 miles of it. So, you know, you're not going to see much. And of course, the military was very careful as to how it and when it flew these classified aircraft, etc. So for many years, from the 50s pretty much through to the late 80s, it was just this innocuous base, really, that didn't pretty much pick up on anybody's radar, because there was just nothing special about it. It was just where the military test flies its secret aircraft from. But that all changed in 1988 when Bob Lazar came forward, a physicist who claimed to have briefly worked at Area 51 on what he said were recovered UFOs. Now, they weren't, as some people have assumed, crashed UFOs, you know, that were sort of dented and destroyed and pummeled. He said that each and every one of them was in very good working condition, apart from one that looked like it had had some sort of dent in it, but all the rest just looked perfect condition. And he said initially he thought they were, you know, sort of classified aircraft that Uncle Sam had built, you know, that we were actually the brains behind flying saucers and had been keeping it secret. But his mind was changed, he said, when he was able to, or he was given a look inside these vehicles and saw that all the seats were sort of really tiny. You know, they would only fit somebody like about 3 feet tall. And the levers and everything else sort of reflected somebody of that height. And he said he was brought on board because he was kind of, although he's a physicist, he was sort of a maverick scientist who thought outside the box as well, which I guess is, you know, sort of the ideal thing you're going to want or need in terms of actually, you know, understanding a technology that's totally alternative to ours. And he said he was brought on board to try and, as he worded it, back-engineer these sources to see if the military could have some understanding of the technology involved and then utilize it, you know, for their own purposes. And he said he was only on the program literally for a few months because despite all the warnings not to talk and keep silent, he told his wife and a number of family members and friends, and apparently the military was supposedly listening in on the conversations, and they basically slung him out the base. Now, that would have been the end of the story, except for a couple of things. Lazar said that he was ordered, basically, to return to the base, and because he'd sort of blown the whistle on the world's biggest secret, he felt that if he'd been out deep into the Nevada desert to this classified military base, he might never come back, you know. And on top of that, somebody tried to shoot out one of the tires on his car. Now, whether that was, as I point out in the book, whether that was a deliberate attempt to try and kill him or it was just some sort of psychological thing to warn him, which I think is probably more likely, he decided to sort of go public because he felt the more visible he was, then, you know, it would, if anything happened to him, it would just bolster what he was saying. Now, when he did go public with his story, you know, sort of all hell broke loose within the whole UFO research field, with some people like Stan thinking, you know, it was just a fabricated story, other people thinking, you know, it was the genuine article. Now, what's interesting about Lazar is that, you know, for every attempt to knock him down, we find something intriguing which suggests he shouldn't be knocked down. For example, you know, a lot of his education records cannot be found for the places where he claimed to have got his background educations. But we do know and we can prove that he did work in the early 80s at the top secret Los Alamos labs on highly advanced physics programs. Ironically, his name actually turns up in the Los Alamos phone directory for 1982. That's verified. And Los Alamos actually denied he worked for them until a journalist in Las Vegas actually found the documentation confirming his employment there, and then they backtracked and said, well, okay, he did work for us, but under a contractor. So, in other words, that they actually initially denied he had any sort of linkage to the official world of secrecy and military programs, and then when something turned up, they backtracked a little bit. He even claimed to have met Dr. Edward Teller, the legendary scientist, and he said that Teller, in a roundabout way, got him on board working out at Area 51. Now, when Teller was put on the spot and asked this, again by a Nevada-based news team, you would imagine that, if you're one of the world's most prestigious scientists and somebody was claiming that you'd got them on board working on a UFO crash retrieval program or whatever, if that was a lie, you would probably want to take legal action to protect your position as one of the world's leading scientists. Teller actually didn't do that. What he did, when he was put on the spot by this journalist in Nevada, he said, well, I don't really remember Bob Lazar, but maybe I did meet him, and if I met him, maybe I liked him, and if I liked him, maybe I referred him to a job, but I don't actually remember if I did refer him to a job or not. It was sort of this very strange situation where Teller covered all his tracks and, in a diplomatic way, answered the question without actually answering the question, instead of saying, hell no, this is a complete lie, and I'm going to take legal action to stamp this out, which is what you would imagine he would have done, but he just squirmed and squirmed. So it's all these sort of weird things like this that really point in the direction that we shouldn't dismiss Lazar's story out of hand, I think.
So again, a base that's big secret, hidden in plain sight. Very interesting stuff you bring up, Nick. We're going to have to take a quick break right now. Kate Valentine here on the UFO Show on 1160 WVNJ, speaking to Nick Redfern, the author of Keep Out. Please post your thoughts on our website, AtlanticCoastUFOs.com. After the show, for more information on all of Nick's books, go to nickredfernsbooks.blogspot.com. Be right back. Hi, welcome back to the Kate Valentine UFO Show on 1160 WVNJ. Our guest today is Mr. Nick Redfern, the very well-known UFO investigator and author, and is here today to discuss his latest book, Keep Out. You can direct your questions and comments to Mr. Redfern now by posting your thoughts on our website, AtlanticCoastUFOs.com. After the show, you can find out so much more about all these hidden bases and other books that Nick has written on his website, nickredfernsbooks.blogspot.com. I hope that was the correct website, Nick.
That was correct, yeah.
Okay, that was the one we had for you. Yep. We had a question that came in from Bobby, and hi, Bobby, and he was wondering if you knew about a hidden base that was just discovered in Alaska between Nome and the naval base. I hadn't heard about that.
No, I actually haven't heard about that one at all, but I mean, what I would say is that, all around the world there are underground military installations, many of which sort of go back to the early years of the Cold War. In a lot of cases, the reason we don't know about these places is because, in some respects, they're not brand new. A lot of them are very old ones that are, constantly being sort of reformatted and added to, So, in other words, some of them have been around for decades, and people just haven't realized what's going on in one particular area, until sort of the bulldozers start moving in and, there's tunneling going on and things like that. So, but unless that happens, a lot of these places, say, built in the 50s or 60s, although there's work still going in them, people just don't know, unless you're a local and you know of the rumors or something like that.
Sure, and why would you know about it? But I would say probably, to me, the scariest one that you cover in your book is Dulce. And there's so much information and misinformation in this theory and that theory and this researcher and that researcher. And I like the way you cover it because you just state what facts are known and then sort of let it up to people to decide. But that's a scary place.
Yeah, I mean, Dulce is in northern New Mexico, and basically the stories surrounding Dulce, which go back to the late 1970s, is that in the town itself there's this huge mesa called the Archuleta Mesa, and there have been rumors for, as I said, since the late 70s, so more than 30 years now, that supposedly deep within inside the mesa is some sort of fortified installation. And, you know, government agencies do build fortified bunkers within mountains. You know, there's a lot all around the world. Like, for example, NORAD, the North American Air Defense Command in Colorado, you know, that's built out of Cheyenne Mountain. You know, so this does happen. But what makes the Dulce story different is that the story is that this isn't a base that sort of falls under the jurisdiction of the U.S. military or the government, but supposedly it falls under the jurisdiction or control of hostile aliens, which, you know, sounds highly controversial, but the story is that, you know, there's this sort of fortified installation that not even the government dares penetrate, you know, and that sort of the keep out warning applies not just to the public, but to the government as well, you know, and the theory is that they're, whatever these entities are, you know, they're sort of so menacing and ominous that the government has just left them alone, you know, deep inside or underground, if you like. Now, of course, a lot of people sort of roll their eyes at these types of stories, the idea that there could be hostile aliens, you know, dwelling deep underground in the, you know, the wilds of northern New Mexico. But what's interesting about Dulce is that the more we dig into the story, the more we can actually verify genuine weird stuff going on in that area. For example, back in the 1970s, the FBI launched an investigation into the whole cattle mutilation mystery. You know, these reports we get across all the U.S. of animals drained of blood and organs removed with what looks like surgical machines and tools, etc. And the FBI launched this investigation because so many of these cases were actually focused around the Dulce area. And it was clear that something organized, orchestrated, and was going on, and it appeared to be done with a great deal of tremendous technology and also a lot of stealth and secrecy, where whoever was doing it had these skills to, you know, just not to be detected at all. And the FBI looked into all the different theories, you know, predators, satanic cults, aliens, UFOs, biological warfare, and even the FBI came away scratching their heads because they just didn't, even the FBI couldn't get an answer. So whoever it was, you know, they weren't even letting the FBI in on whatever the full picture was. But you can actually find these files now. They've been declassified through the Freedom of Information Act. They're online at the FBI's website, which is called The Vault, and you can download them as PDFs now. But so that's one of the most intriguing things, is the fact that the area was heavily populated by cattle mutilations and associated sightings of UFOs and black helicopters all around Dulce in the late 70s. Now, if we go back further, in the 1960s, only about 10 miles from the Dulce area, in 1967, a very small, sort of low-yield atomic device was actually exploded deep underground. As I said, only about 10 miles from the Dulce area. And this was part of something called Operation Gas Buggy, and the idea was to set off these bombs to provoke the release of natural gas, which the natural gas could then be basically, you know, turned into a source of energy. This was a Department of Energy project. Now, if you go to the area today where this blasting was done, you can actually find signs warning you on a penalty of basically arrest and a fine not to dig underground anywhere in that vicinity. Now, of course, people say, well, that's because, you know, they set off this device and they're worried about contamination or, you know, people falling into holes where the ground's being blasted below. Other researchers think, you know, is it only a coincidence that there's supposedly an underground base there and people are being warned not to dig underground? You know, is it, in other words, is the gas story a cover to keep people away from the underground base? Now, whatever the truth of the matter, you know, the fact is that we have this area, Dulce, where there are rumors of underground bases, and we can prove there being cattle mutilations, black helicopters, UFO sightings, and even huge government signs warning people under no circumstances will you dig underground in this area. So it's things like this that leave the whole mystery, if you like, wide open as to, you know, what may have happened there or what may still be going on there.
All right. Okay, Valentine here. I'm speaking with Nick Redfern on 1160 WVNJ about his book, Keep Out. Nick, we had a great question that came in from Earl. Would you have any comment on the Paul Benowitz affair? Paul apparently saw and filled Earl prefers the term UAP, for an extended period of time near and at the weapons storage area at Kirtland Air Force Base outside of Albuquerque, across from his home. His inquiries into the matter eventually brought Doty into the mix, and he's wondering about the nature of the UAP that Benowitz witnessed. His understanding is that the underground base at Dulce was part of the misinformation to confuse Benowitz was really a tragic figure. And also Bobby wrote in too, Bobby Drake, he said, when you talk about Dulce, I think of Philip Schneider. There's another tragic figure. The two of them, there's a lot of nasty stuff that went on with that base.
Yeah, well, Paul Benowitz, for people who aren't aware of it, he was a scientist who ran a company called Thunder Laboratories, which actually, the offices backed onto the fence of Kirtland Air Force Base in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And when I say backed onto the fence, I mean literally, the building was outside of the fence. And he was someone with an interest in UFOs who began seeing these weird objects flying predominantly at night over Kirtland Air Force Base and the surrounding Manzano Range, as it's called. And, of course, there's a lot of controversy over what it was he was seeing. Benowitz concluded that he was seeing genuine UFOs, from somewhere else. Other researchers have suggested, could they have been like early experimental unmanned aircraft or, these remotely piloted drones, or it could be a combination of the two, we just don't know. But what is interesting is that when Benowitz began doing his research and came to these conclusions that, there were aliens flying around and the government knew something about it, he started telling just about everybody he could. And so what the Air Force did was to sort of launch like a psychological warfare program against him, where they basically pummeled him with all these horror stories about aliens invading the planet and hostile aliens, holed up in the Dulce area deep underground. And it basically sort of gave him nightmares to the point where eventually he had almost like a complete mental, nervous collapse and had to drop out the subject. I mean, literally, these stories and these sort of whistleblowers coming forward from the military relating all these stories just plagued his mind to where he just collapsed. Now, of course, the big question is, was Benowitz on the right path? And these were people who were actually trying to help him to get information to him? Or was it the fact that, as other researchers believe, he'd uncovered classified data on unclassified military programs and they were trying to swamp him with fake UFO material to keep him away from the other stuff? But what's interesting is that this was sort of 78, 79, 80, when this was sort of at its height, or sort of 79, 80, 81 when it was at its height. But the verifiable weirdness about Dulce goes back further. For example, the FBI's files on Dulce and the cattle mutilations date from 74 to 76. This is long before the whole Benowitz thing kicked off. That didn't really kick off till 78, 79. And the gas buggy stuff and all these signs erected telling people to keep out of the Dulce area, they were erected in 67. So in other words, the Benowitz story is confusing because if the government or whoever was involved in this was basically just solely lying and spreading fake stories to him to confuse him, why choose an area that was already steeped in high strangeness and that was, in some respects, classified and off limits in terms of digging? It was almost like they took a bit of reality and swamped it with a lot of fake stuff, which often works, in terms of confusing the real picture. So, although I don't doubt that Benowitz was fed a great deal of disinformation, the Dulce angle is problematic because of the pre-existing weirdness in the area that predated Benowitz's involvement.
Yeah, we'll have to take another quick break. Kate Valentine here. I'm speaking with Nick Redfern. We're on 1160 WVNJ. Nick is talking about his book, Keep Out. To voice your opinion or to relate an experience you may have had, post your comments right now on Atlantic Coast UFOs.com. After the break, you can find out a lot more about this by going to Nick's website, nickredfernsbooks.blogspot.com. Be right back after a short break and hope to hear from you then. Hi, welcome back to the Kate Valentine UFO Show on 1160 WVNJ. Our guest today is Mr. Nick Redfern, talking about his book, Keep Out. You're welcome to add to this discussion by posting your thoughts, your opinions, or if you have had any experiences, we'd love to hear about them. Post that all on our website, AtlanticCoastUFOs.com, to find out more about these secret places, and there's many, many more. We just can't go all over them in 1 hour. Go to Nick Redfern's website, nickredfernsbooks.blogspot.com. So just to get away from something creepy like Dulce, I was thinking as a bit of a travelogue for some of our listeners that are in London right now, we might warn them to beware certain places on the London Underground Railways because that supposedly houses many a strange creature. Some of them even maybe humans. Is that correct, Nick?
Yeah, I mean, everybody kind of thinks the London Underground, it's kind of it's how people get around London, which for the most part it is, it's this vast array of underground tunnels, like a huge network of rail, kind of like the New York subway system. Mm-hmm. But in the same way that, people talk about the New York subway system and the sewers having like alligators running around in them, there are a lot of weird legends attached to what's secretly going on deep below London in these old tunnels as well. Now, what we can verify is that at the height of the Second World War, when the Germans were launching nightly bombing missions on Britain, obviously London was one of the main targets. So what happened was that the London Underground was basically, for the most part, closed down. And the tunnels, because they were, hundreds of feet below ground, people, when the nightly, sirens would go off to warn people that the Germans were flying across the Channel to attack, everybody would head deep into the London Underground tunnels, with sleeping bags and pillows, literally, and there would be thousands and thousands of people, just waiting it out underground until the bombings had finished. So, in other words, we know that some of the old tunnels, etc., were converted to, like, emergency areas for people. Now, at the same time, the Prime Minister during the Second World War, Sir Winston Churchill, he had like an emergency management office, like a bunker deep within the London Underground as well. And what they did, they used like a refurbished, reconditioned old station that had been closed down. Again, a lot of people don't realise that, a number of the original stations, although they still exist, they're no longer in use. Sort of new tunnels have been built and the old ones have been blocked off, etc. So Churchill had one of these reconfigured, so again, he would be safe from the bombings as well. So in other words, even official secrecy plays a role in the London Underground in terms of having bunkers in some of the old tunnels and stations, and also areas where, for example, classified documentation has been held by the government in sort of vaults deep in the underground too. But there are a lot of weirder stories that sort of go away from government secrecy as such and more into sort of, I guess almost like cryptozoological, monstrous type realms as well, with strange creatures. One of the weirdest of all, which has long sort of perpetuated, deals with something that become known as the London Subterraneans. And the legend is that, deep below the London Underground, there are in these ancient tunnels, and there are also rumours of tunnels going back way before the Underground was built, built who knows when and who by. But the theory is that, there are sort of primitive, cannibalistic type of people roaming the lower depths of the old tunnels, and living deep under London and feeding on the occasional hobo or whatever, and certainly a lot of these are kind of folkloric, like in the same way that you have the stories of the alligators in the sewers in New York. But there are a couple of verifiable cases where alligators actually have been found in the sewers. People don't realize this. There's actually one that was verified in 1935 and also one more. And it's kind of like that with these stories about these sort of devolved humans deep below London, where one of the people I interviewed for the book, a former police officer who was in the British police force in the late 1960s and early 70s, and so this was long after his retirement, which probably had a bearing on his willingness to speak. He said that they'd investigated a number of suspicious deaths on the London Underground, where it looked like people had been sort of savagely attacked by a wild animal, and they were actually basically covered up under the guise of, like a mugging or something like that, or the person fell on the tracks and got injured and, cut to pieces that way. But he said that there was a lot of weirdness associated with these deaths, and people seeing sort of strange characters in some of the tunnels, with sort of long matted hair and disheveled clothes and things like this. And he said that, they didn't really prove anything, but the mere fact that people were seeing these beings, if you like, and associating them with the deaths, it sort of really led the police to clamp down on it for fear of, hysteria breaking out. So it's a very, very weird area, on the surface, no pun intended, it looks like a normal underground rail system. But when you find all these different stories about government secrets and old tunnels blocked off and others opened up for secret military programs, etc., well, it takes on a different kind of angle, if you like.
Yeah, and there's always been sort of these tales going around about cave people and tunnel people, and certainly not just in London, but that seems to be worldwide.
Well, I think part of it is folkloric in the sense that people have a fascination with caves and tunnels for some reason. They're kind of seen as spooky and mysterious, but that doesn't necessarily mean things aren't going on. I mean, all cultures around the world do have legends of sort of advanced magical beings that lived underground in ancient tunnels and caves. And, you often find, or you almost always find, that when there's a legend, it has some basis in fact to it. So it wouldn't surprise me, if in times past sort of devolved people or people who'd gone wild, sort of reverted to a semi-animalistic lifestyle in times past when, food was scarce, etc. And who knows, maybe in certain parts they're still down there, oblivious to us and we're oblivious to them for the most part.
Well, it would be interesting to find out. As far as the alligators in New York, back in the 30s, a lot of people coming back from Florida would bring these little baby alligators with them. And then they'd flush them. And I think actually you're right. There really were incidences of them being reported. So at least that's one theory that we've got nailed, even though the rest of them are sort of hard to do. Kate Valentine, I'm speaking with Nick Redfern. We're on 1160 WVNJ talking about his book, Keep Out. Nick, I think the thing I found most intriguing was that you brought up the possibility of there being existing alien or even human bases on the moon. And that also seems to have some basis, in fact.
Yeah, this is, again, something that not many people are aware of. When we think of, trips to the moon and astronauts, we always think of NASA, because NASA is the public face of space exploration. And even though there isn't really, for any intents and purposes, a manned program anymore, it's pretty much been shut down when the last shuttle was basically put into retirement. But NASA is still perceived as the public face. A lot of people don't realize that over the years, military agencies have also taken a deep interest in outer space. And a number of the shuttle launches in the 80s were actually not scientific or astronomical missions. They were actually, the payload inside the shuttle was actually to launch spy satellites for organizations like the CIA and the National Reconnaissance Office. So, the military has a vested interest in outer space. And this actually goes back to the late 1950s, even before NASA as a unified official body was formed. And the US Army, for example, created this classified program called Project Horizon. And the basic idea was to build an outpost on the moon, which would be added to over time and become bigger and bigger to eventually become like a huge fortified installation. But it would start off, like the sort of typical little thing you'd see like at the North Pole or the South Pole. And this wasn't for sort of, again, for astronomical or, scientific reasons. It was basically, this was the height of the Cold War, late 50s. And, despite what both sides said, the Russians and Americans and the British, everybody, that don't launch any missiles at us because we can destroy you. The fact is that in a real war, nobody would win. We would have all gotten destroyed. And so a lot of it was just bluff and bravado, and neither side struck first because they secretly knew that neither could win, But the idea was the U.S. Army had this plan that in the event that the Russians did launch a sneak attack and it was catastrophically successful, how could America fight back? So the plan was, well, why don't we have an outpost on the moon which we can arm with nuclear missiles, and in the event we get attacked and our bases get taken out, we could still guide these, launch these missiles from the moon and guide them down through Earth orbit to Russia. So that was the plan, to have like an outpost that the Russians had no chance of reaching, but that we could basically use to reach them, if you like. Now, the plan that the military had was to have this base up and running by 1965, which is incredible. You think Neil Armstrong didn't set foot on the moon until 1969, but the Project Horizon files, which are now being declassified, or at least a few of them have, talk about the military wanting to get this secret base up and running in rudimentary form no later than 65. And people say, well, the project must have been cancelled because we've never seen any proof of that. But what we do know is that in that very year, 65, people were talking about classified NASA photographs that seem to show some sort of installation on the far side of the moon. One of the people who spoke about this is a former U.S. Air Force man named Carl Wolf, who said that he was openly told, albeit in sort of a secret, stealthy fashion, that NASA had captured photographs of some sort of installation on the far side of the moon, and NASA had no idea whatsoever who built it. Now, this sort of brings into question, well, if NASA didn't know, and they're the space program, then clearly it wasn't one of our bases, or anything that we put up there. That sort of gives rise to the alien theory. But on the other hand, knowing that the U.S. Army was clandestinely working on this secret program to build a base there, which had nothing to do with NASA's programs, that also gives rise to the idea, well, could it have been a classified military base that not even NASA knew about? Or could it be a combination of the two? Is the military up there because they know aliens are up there, so they're watching them? It could be sort of a combination of all three, potentially.
Well, we're going to get right back to that after a short break. So Kate Valentine here. I'm speaking with Nick Redfern. We're on 1160 WVNJ. We're talking about his book, Keep Out. Those are the top secret places that the governments don't want you to know about. To voice your opinion or relate an experience, please post your comments right now at AtlanticCoastUFOs.com. For further information about all this, please go to Nick's website, nickredfernsbooks.blogspot.com. We'll be right back. Hope to hear from you. Hi, welcome back to the Kate Valentine UFO Show. Our guest today is Mr. Nick Redfern, a very well-known UFO investigator and author. Today he's here discussing his latest book, Keep Out. You can direct your questions and comments to Mr. Redfern right now by posting them on our website, AtlanticCoastUFOs.com. After the show, you can find out so much more by going to Nick's website, nickredfernsbooks.blogspot.com. So, Nick, getting back to this potentially alien and or human base on the moon, we know that supposedly a ham operator came across some of the early landings there, saying that there already were bases on the moon, and then the flyby on the dark side of the moon, saying Santa Claus is here. And so there's been a lot of talk about it, but you said in your book back in the 50s that Werner von Braun really sunk his teeth into this, thinking that, and certainly correctly so, that a base on the moon would be a great jumping off spot for any further space exploration. So there does seem to be some real solid evidence that something is definitely going on up there.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, it's like if one day, we do sort of send manned missions to Mars, etc., then, the sort of rockets that took men to the moon, so the brute force, just, this huge rocket with just a tiny capsule on the top, the reason why those rockets were so big was because the rocket was just full of fuel, and it was just enough to get people to the moon. Same with the space shuttle, it has these huge boosters that took it into Earth orbit. But to go to the planets, we're going to need, people have suggested, like a nuclear fusion type engine, and of course the big concern is you don't want something nuclear powered taking off near a city on Earth, and if it catastrophically explodes on takeoff, you've basically got an atomic explosion. So the idea is that, if we're going to build something like this, then let's do it and launch it, if you like, off the Earth. So that's one of the reasons why the moon, is so strategically well placed, because it's not that far away. And if we could build, a highly advanced spacecraft from there, in the event it went wrong, it wouldn't cause any sort of disastrous fallout or anything like that on the planet. So.
Yeah, and there's been so much folklore about the moon itself. Like I forget honestly, but there was a monk back in the 1400s that wrote about seeing a lot of lights on the moon, and there's still tales of that. And actually, some of my friends have seen lights on the moon from time to time.
Yeah, no, you're right. We get weird reports of strange lights. These tales about bases, about astronauts supposedly seeing UFOs on the moon, installations where the military, or government, and also strange, what look like rock carvings and structures. There's actually one very weird one that looks almost like a tower on the moon, like a thin tower, and it's, when you see the picture, it's hard to sort of reconcile that with just something that nature would have constructed, just like a perfectly almost formed vertical spire, if you like. So.
Yeah, I think a lot of information will be coming out about the moon in the near future. A little bit off topic though, but Dale Lewis wrote in and he was wondering if you thought a lot of the slow-moving triangle UFOs that are sighted are actually stealth blimps, because he saw one about 8 years ago out in the Colorado mountains. I was lucky enough to see one over the New York City area too, and it certainly didn't. It just seemed like too big to come from outer space to me. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I'll be honest. Kind of in two minds over these so-called black triangles, because there's absolutely no doubt whatsoever that there's been a definite increase in these types of reports from sort of the mid-1980s onwards. These large black triangular-shaped craft that seem to be able to fly at very low speeds, or slow speeds, I should say, and then speed up to incredible speeds. They fly in almost complete silence, totally black. The military denies they belong to them, but then, the military has denied the existence of the stealth bomber and the stealth fighter until they were unveiled. So people have suggested, could it be like a highly advanced next generation stealth aircraft? Now that's to me, that's entirely plausible, but one of the reasons why I don't think that at least tells the full story is that through the Freedom of Information Act, and particularly in Britain through their files which have surfaced in the last few years, there are a number of reports of these triangles exactly the same as those reported today, back in the 60s. I'll give you a classic one. There's a case from a guy named Geoffrey Brown who lived in the county of Yorkshire, England, and he reported a sighting of like a fleet of these flying triangles in 1965. And this is a genuine report. It's been declassified, and I actually was able to track down Geoffrey Brown and interview him. And his official report, or the report that he filed that was then, marked for officialdom, talks about these flying triangles being about 100 feet in length. They were lit up by 3 lights below, and they had these rounded corners instead of angled corners, and they had this low humming noise. Now, the low humming noise, the illumination below, and the rounded corners are classic facets of today's flying triangles that people report. They're all, the classic signature signs of what people see. But this report from Geoffrey Brown was 65. This was long before people were talking about these more modern-day flying triangles, and yet his description was exactly what people have been talking about from the 80s onwards over the US. So, it's difficult to understand when you've got a report like this, which is verifiably filed with the Ministry of Defence in England nearly 50 years ago, and then how you reconcile that with these modern-day reports if they're just military aircraft. If we were flying them back in the 60s, why weren't they put on the battlefield, say in Vietnam or wherever? So I think, like a lot of the UFO mystery, I think some UFOs belong to somebody else. Whether they're extraterrestrial, interdimensional, I don't know, but in my mind, they exist and they're coming here. But equally, I think as our technology develops, there are more and more domestic UFOs, if you like. And I think that's the problem, that the more and more our technology advances, it's going to become even more difficult to differentiate between what are our UFOs and someone else's. And I think there's often a tendency to want to pigeonhole it into it's this or that. But I think with the black triangles, some of them could be ours and some of them could be somebody else's.
Well, I tell you, case in point, the U.S. Navy just released news that the UFO-shaped drone was being flown now over Washington, D.C., and when it was trucked into the city, everyone thought they had seen a UFO.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that was pretty. That was, and again, a little bit off topic, but I thought it was an interesting question because I haven't heard of this. Al had written in and asked if you knew anything about the black-eyed children phenomenon. I have never heard of this.
Yeah, basically, this sort of goes into the whole issue, or some people believe it's sort of connected with alien abductions. You know, in abductions, people talk about genetic experimentation, and people often see these so-called hybrid babies and hybrid children that kind of look like a combination of us and them, if you like. And one of the sort of outgrowths of this sort of research, although it's not specifically just linked to abductions, is the so-called black-eyed children, where people have received almost like visits at the front door by these black-eyed children, as they could become known, that demand to be let in. It almost has like creepy Men in Black aspects to it, you know, where they seem to turn up on people's doorsteps and people kind of get frightened and intimidated and won't open the doors. There's a lot of stories like that, and other ones where it's been suggested, you know, that the black-eyed children are kind of like an alien hybrid or something. Other people take the view, you know, that they're more paranormal or occult-based, you know, some sort of like a negative entity or energy in some form. There's actually a very good book written all about this by a friend of mine called David Weatherly, which looks at all the different theories and the different parallels, and it's called The Black-Eyed Children. And that's sort of, for me at least, is like the definitive book on it. But it's sort of a very weird mystery which has UFO overtones, but also has sort of paranormal and occult aspects attached to it as well.
Wow. Well, thank you. I had never heard about that. I'll have to look into it. But we're coming sort of to the end of the hour, and I was wondering, what do you conclude about all this? So many bases, so little time.
Well, yeah, I mean, in concise terms, what I would say is that, you know, to have installations that are fortified and classified, it allows a tremendous amount of secret work to go on. And much of this is just, you know, sort of valid, normal, everyday stuff to protect the country. And for the most part, you know, I don't dig into that in the book because, you know, I'm not interested in recklessly revealing information, you know, on our military capabilities. I focus on those places in the book that deal with paranormal stuff or UFO stuff, etc. But I think, you know, strategically placing somewhere out in the desert and fortifying it, etc., that explains how and why it's so easy for government agencies to hide the truth about UFOs, because if your information is held, you know, 90 miles from or 90 minutes from downtown Las Vegas in the heart of the blistering hot desert and no one can get out there, well, that makes keeping secrets even easier. So, you know, when people say the government can't keep secrets, I say, well, try getting out to Area 51. Good luck. You know, you won't be able to. So secrets are being kept.
I like the quote from your book. You said, you know, what happens in Area 51 stays in Area 51.
Yeah, just like it's near neighbor Las Vegas. So.
Well, as usual, this hour has come to an end all too soon, and our audience would love to get further information about all this, I know. So what's the best website, and anything new coming up? Any conferences, lectures? What's going on?
Yeah, sure. Well, people can reach me at nickredfernsbooks.blogspot.com, or if they type me into Facebook, just type in Nick Redfern, they can find me that way. I'm always pleased to chat and, you know, talk to people and discuss things and whatever. All my books are available online, Amazon, etc., or Barnes & Noble, you know, bookshops. As for conferences and lectures, I have one called the Austin Center for Spiritual Living here in Texas. I live in Dallas, but this will be in Austin the last weekend of September. Second week of September, I'll be in Oklahoma doing a talk about Bigfoot at the Cryptid Fest. So
sounds great. I'll tell you, if you're out there in Oklahoma, go see it. Thanks again, Nick. Really, thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Kate.
You're welcome. And thank you, as always, to Dave and Bill, whose expertise make this show possible. Thanks to our sponsors for keeping us going, but mostly thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this discussion as much as I did. To hear it again, tune in Sunday at 4 or pick it up on our still free podcast. See you next week. Our guest will be Scott P. Davis. This is Kate Valentine. Have a wonderful weekend. And remember, keep your eye on the sky. Bye.
It's the world's most famous secret base. It's like, well, how can you have a famous secret base? You know, it's either famous or it's secret. How can it be both? But actually, that is the case. You know, Area 51 out in the Nevada desert. Everybody knows about it. Everybody's heard the rumors about crashed UFOs being stored there, but nobody can actually get there. You know, that's what makes it sort of a fascinating place, if you like.
Yeah, it was great. But you say that came to attention, or to the public attention, through Bob Lazar, who himself is an extraordinarily controversial figure. Yeah. I mean, even Stanton Friedman, who's also, he backs up his research with solid investigation, and he felt that Lazar was totally a bunk, in his words.
Stan put it, bunk. But, yeah, I mean, Area 51, the whole story is an interesting one.
Yeah.
A lot of people think there is no such place, but there actually is. It actually is part of...
Mighty phantoms of the evening sky, to whom do these celestial steeds belong, when you appear to us like gods on high, what brings you here to mystify?
Hi, good afternoon, and thanks for tuning into the Kate Valentine UFO Show on 1160 WVNJ. Returning today as our guest is Mr. Nick Redfern. Now, if you have had even a passing interest in UFOs, you are familiar with Mr. Redfern and his investigations, writings, and appearances on numerous TV and radio shows. Now, today he's going to be here with us to talk about his latest book entitled Keep Out. So welcome to the show, Nick. Thanks so much for being here.
Okay, thanks for having me on again.
It's great. Listen, I was wondering if it's okay with you, I'd just like to read the first paragraph of your book, the introduction.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, it goes, Area 51, Hangar 18, Montauk, Pine Gap.
World, hanging around a military base or a classified installation is not a good thing to do. So I basically sort of take an investigative journalistic approach to it, which is what I do in my sort of regular writing as well. And again, to use the Freedom of Information Act to interview sort of retired military and government people, hopefully on the record, you know, and get them to talk about their recollections, etc., and try and put the story together that way. Because I think when you're dealing with controversial issues, you have to do it in a credible fashion, because otherwise you just come across looking like, you know, just like a crazy person who sees a conspiracy around every corner, you know, and the sort of image that the media has of us, but in reality most people are sort of very in the field and level-headed, and we do our research as we would applying to any story. So, you know, things like Area 51, you know, I mean,
yeah.
Area 51, it's kind of like an oxymoron, because...
It's been my favorite book of yours.
Oh, well, thanks. I mean, it's one of those things where, you know, it's when you're writing a book, you want to be able to get across to people from the very beginning as to what it is you're actually writing about. So, you know, I always feel that if you can kind of give them, you know, sort of drop them in at the deep end, if you like, at the very beginning, and then expand on what it is actually that you've summarized to start with. So.
Now, one of the points you make is that these bases, although what goes on in them is secret, they themselves are somewhat hidden. So how did you find out how does this information come to you?
Well, I mean, a lot of the time, I just use the Freedom of Information Act. You know, I don't do anything illegally. You know, I'm not one of these people who sort of tries to jump the fence at military bases and things. You know, to me, that's just stupid. You know what I mean? And,
yes, I know.
To take that approach, or to hack computers and all that sort of thing, you know, to me, that's just reckless, and people deserve what they get, basically, at the end of the day, and they're going to get, you know, in today.
Fort Detrick, Rudlow Manor, Zitker, Porton Down, the Dugway Proving Ground, and Dulce Base. These are just a handful of the many highly classified installations of which the governments of the United States, Australia, China, Russia, the United Kingdom, and elsewhere prefer that we, the general public, remain steadfastly ignorant. Those governments have extremely good reasons for wishing us to remain in the dark. It is at these secret facilities that for decades clandestine research is said to have been undertaken into, among other things, lethal viruses, genetic manipulation, crashed UFOs, deceased alien entities, biological warfare, mind control experimentation, futuristic aircraft and spacecraft, teleportation, weather modification, invisibility, time travel, and much, much more of a conspiratorial and cosmic nature. That is one hell of a paragraph, Nick. That was great. That was phenomenal. And it sort of summed up your whole book, which was, I told you, that was